In the winter of 1982, deep in the isolated Amish settlements of Kentucky, a wedding took place that would forever stain the snow-covered hills with unspeakable horror. Sarah and Rebecca Yoder, identical twins bound by more than blood, stood side by side in their plain dresses as they both married Ezekiel Miller. The community whispered it was God's will. But God had nothing to do with what happened in that farmhouse. This is the true story of a covenant that should never have been made, and the blood price that was paid when it was broken. If you're fascinated by real stories of terror that lurk in the most unexpected places, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the darkness that hides in plain sight. Now, let's descend into the nightmare that consumed the Yoder twins and everyone who stood too close to their forbidden union. Chapter 1: The Binding. The Yoder twins were born during a blood moon in October 1960, an omen the community's elders chose to ignore. From their first breath, Sarah and Rebecca were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences, sharing dreams that felt too vivid to be mere fantasy, and possessing an uncanny ability to sense each other's pain across distances. Their father, Jacob Yoder, was a stern man who believed in the old ways, the ways that went deeper than the Ordnung, the rules that governed Amish life. He believed in blood bonds, in sacrifices that tied families to the land, in agreements that transcended the moral world. When the twins turned 16, Jacob called them into the barn on a November night when frost covered everything like a funeral shroud. What happened in that barn was never spoken of directly, but the twins emerged different. They moved in perfect synchronization now, as if controlled by a single consciousness. They began to speak less, their already quiet natures becoming almost spectral. And they began to dream of him, Ezekiel Miller, a widower whose first wife had died under circumstances no one discussed, whose farmhouse sat at the edge of the settlement like a tooth waiting to bite. Ezekiel was 42 years old, with hands scarred from decades of labor and eyes that held something older than his years. He had no children from his first marriage, a fact that troubled the community since children were considered the greatest blessing. But Ezekiel didn't seem troubled. He seemed patient, as if waiting for something specific, something promised. When he began courting both twins simultaneously in 1981, the community elders were disturbed but not entirely surprised. Jacob Yoder had arranged it, they learned, though how and why remained shrouded in mystery and fear. The courtship was brief and strange. Ezekiel would arrive at the Yoder farmhouse at dusk, and both twins would sit with him in the parlor, one on each side, while their father watched from the shadows. They never spoke of love or future plans in the way normal couples did. Instead, Ezekiel would read from an old book written in Pennsylvania Dutch, words that sounded more like incantations than scripture. The twins would respond in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony that made their younger siblings flee upstairs with hands over their ears. By December, the wedding was arranged, one ceremony, two brides, one groom. The bishop initially refused to perform it, citing both law and tradition. But Jacob Yoder met with him privately, and whatever was said or shown during that meeting left the bishop pale and shaking. He agreed to conduct a private ceremony, with only immediate family present, in the deep of winter when the world was frozen and dead. The date was set for January 15, 1982, during the darkest phase of the M.O. Chapter 2: The Ceremony. The wedding took place not in the church, but in Ezekiel's farmhouse, a decision that broke with every tradition. The house stood isolated, surrounded by bare black trees that reached toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers. Snow fell steadily that morning, covering the ground so completely that all tracks disappeared within minutes, as if the earth itself wanted to hide what was about to occur. Only 8 people attended: the twins, Ezekiel, their father Jacob, their mother Emma who wept silently throughout, the bishop, and 2 witnesses whose names have been erased from all records. The ceremony began at noon, but the interior of the house remained dim, lit only by oil lamps that cast writhing shadows on the walls. The bishop's voice shook as he read the vows, but they were not the standard Amish wedding vows. These words were older, darker, binding the three souls together in a way that marriage alone could not. Sarah stood on Ezekiel's right, Rebekah on his left, all three holding hands in a triangle formation that made Emma sob harder into her handkerchief. When the bishop asked for the exchange of vows, something impossible happened. Both twins spoke simultaneously with Ezekiel, their three voices merging into one sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The oil lamps flickered violently, and the temperature in the room plummeted so dramatically that breath became visible mist. The witnesses later reported feeling a presence enter the room, something vast and cold that pressed against their chests and made it difficult to breathe. One of them, a man named Abraham Stoltzfus, would die of a heart attack exactly 1 year later, screaming about the third bride in his final moments. The ceremony concluded with a ritual that was witnessed but never fully explained. Ezekiel produced a silver knife, ornate and clearly very old, nothing like the plain tools the Amish used. He made a small cut on his left palm, then did the same to each twin, Sarah's right hand, Rebekah's left. They pressed the wounds together, all three hands interlocked, blood mingling while the bishop recited words in a language that sounded like German but wasn't, something more guttural and ancient. The blood didn't drip to the floor as it should have, instead, it seemed to be absorbed into their skin, leaving no trace except for the small cuts that would later heal into identical scars. After the blood ritual, Ezekiel kissed each twin, and they kissed each other, sealing the triangle. The witnesses reported that in that moment, the shadows on the walls seemed to move independently of the lamp flames, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like figures watching the proceedings with approval. The wedding feast that followed was eaten in near silence, the food tasting of ash in everyone's mouths. Emma Yoder didn't eat at all, she simply stared at her daughters with an expression of profound grief, as if she were attending their funeral rather than their wedding. As night fell, the guests departed quickly, desperate to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Jacob Yoder was the last to leave, and before he did, Ezekiel placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something that made the stern man nod in satisfaction. Whatever debt had been paid, whatever bargain had been struck, was now complete. The three newlyweds stood in the doorway watching the families disappear into the snow, Sarah and Rebekah on either side of their husband, all three wearing expressions that could have been contentment or could have been the blank satisfaction of predators who have successfully trapped their prey. Chapter 3, The Arrangement. The newlyweds' domestic arrangement shocked even the most understanding community members who learned of it. The farmhouse had 3 bedrooms upstairs, but only one was used, the master bedroom where all 3 slept in a single bed custom-built by Ezekiel himself. It was enormous, more like a platform than a traditional bed, covered in quilts stitched by the twins in patterns that hurt the eyes if you looked too long. Neighbors who visited in those early weeks reported that the room smelled of copper and something else, something organic and wrong that they couldn't identify. The daily routine was regimented with disturbing precision. Sarah and Rebekah moved through the house like mirror images, performing tasks in perfect synchronization. When one stirred the pot on the stove, the other's hand would move in an identical motion even if she was in another room. They dressed identically every day, not just in similar plain dresses as twins might, but in precisely the same garments, alternating them in a system that meant they were essentially sharing a single wardrobe and a single identity. They braided each other's hair in complex patterns that seemed to serve some purpose beyond mere style, patterns that changed with the phases of the moon. Ezekiel worked his farm with unusual success that first spring. His crops grew faster and fuller than his neighbors', his animals were healthier, and his dairy cows produced twice the milk they should have. Some attributed it to God's blessing on the union, but others noticed the way the twins would walk the property line at dawn and dusk, their lips moving in silent recitation, their bare feet leaving prints in the soil that seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. Abraham Stoltzfus, before his death, confided to his wife that he'd seen the twins standing in the field at midnight, hands joined, while something moved between the corn rows, something tall and skeletal that shouldn't exist. The twins never appeared in public separately after the marriage. If Sarah went to the community store, Rebecca accompanied her. If Rebecca attended a quilting bee, Sarah sat beside her. They spoke rarely, and when they did, they completed each other's sentences in a way that seemed less charming and more like a single mind operating two bodies. The community's initial discomfort evolved into active fear when children began to cry upon seeing the twins, and horses would panic if they came too close to the Miller farmhouse. By summer, the whispers had intensified. Women reported seeing figures in the windows of the farmhouse at night, 3 figures, but sometimes a 4th, taller than the others, with proportions that didn't seem quite human. The bishop received multiple complaints, but when he visited the house to counsel the family, he emerged ashen-faced and refused to discuss what he'd seen or heard. He would only say that the covenant had been made and could not be unmade, and that the community should pray for their own souls, not those of the Millers. The most disturbing development came in August when both twins announced they were pregnant. The announcement itself was strange. They made it simultaneously, speaking in perfect unison to a group of women at church. "We carry his legacy. The covenant is bearing fruit." The fact that both were pregnant was unusual but not impossible. What terrified the community was that they appeared to be at exactly the same stage, experiencing identical symptoms at identical times, as if they shared not just a husband but a single pregnancy distributed across 2 bodies. The midwife who examined them, a woman named Ruth Beeler who delivered half the babies in the settlement, locked herself in her house for 3 days after the examination and refused to discuss what she discovered. Chapter 4, The Quickening. As fall approached and the twins' pregnancies advanced, the atmosphere around the Miller farmhouse became increasingly oppressive. The leaves on the trees surrounding the property turned black before falling, a blight that affected no other farms in the area. The well water, which had always been clear and sweet, took on a metallic taste that reminded those who drank it of blood. Animals refused to cross the property line. Even dogs would stop dead and whimper rather than set paw on Miller land. The few brave souls who visited reported that time felt different inside the house, moving slower or faster than it should, making hour-long visits feel like minutes or entire days compressed into moments. The twins moved through their pregnancy with disturbing synchronicity. They experienced morning sickness at precisely the same moment, their bodies convulsing in identical rhythms. When one felt the baby kick, the other would gasp and place her hand in the same location on her own belly. They slept constantly now, sometimes 16 hours a day, and when they were awake, they seemed partially absent, their eyes focused on something no one else could see. Ezekiel became fiercely protective, barring all visitors except for Ruth Beeler, the midwife, whose visits grew briefer and more reluctant with each passing week. Ruth finally broke her silence to her sister in October, swearing her to secrecy before whispering the truth that had terrorized her. The twins weren't carrying 2 separate babies, they were carrying 2 halves of the same child. When she pressed her ear to Sarah's belly, she heard a heartbeat, but when she listened to Rebecca's, she heard the same heartbeat at the exact same rhythm, as if the sound was transmitting between them. The babies moved in perfect mirror synchronization. When Sarah's child pushed against her right side, Rebecca's pushed against her left. It was as if a single entity was being gestated across 2 wombs, split between 2 bodies, waiting to be made whole at birth. November brought the first death. Little Mary Zook, a 6-year-old who lived on the neighboring farm, went missing on a Tuesday evening. Search parties scoured the area for 3 days before her body was found on the Miller property, at the exact boundary line where the black leaves accumulated in unnatural drifts. She had no marks on her, no signs of violence or struggle, but her body was impossibly cold, frozen from the inside out despite the mild weather. Her eyes were open, and those who found her swore they reflected an image of the Miller farmhouse even though she was facing away from it. The coroner's report listed exposure as the cause, but exposure couldn't explain why every drop of blood had drained from her body into the earth, leaving her corpse as white as the winter's snow to come. The community held a meeting without the Millers present. Fear had transformed into terror, and terror into desperate deliberation. Some argued for bringing in outside authorities, but others knew the English law couldn't help with what was happening. This was something older, something that law enforcement had no jurisdiction over. The bishop stood before the congregation and finally revealed what he'd learned. Jacob Yoder had made a deal decades ago, promising his daughters to something that lived in the space between the visible and invisible world, something that demanded blood and belief in equal measure. Ezekiel was not just a husband, he was a vessel, a doorway the entity would use to enter the physical world permanently. And the twins were not victims, they were willing participants, chosen before birth, marked by the blood moon, prepared their entire lives for this purpose. The meeting concluded with a vote. They would perform an intervention, a ritual of their own to break the covenant before the twins gave birth. It would have to happen soon. Both women were now 8 months pregnant, and whatever was growing inside them was running out of time to complete its transformation. 12 men volunteered to confront the Millers, to force them to break the blood bond or, if necessary, to stop the births by any means required. They would go on the new moon, in 3 days' time, when darkness would be deepest and their own prayers might hold more power against whatever darkness had taken root in the Miller home. They armed themselves not with guns but with faith, with blessed water and herbs, with prayers written on paper and sewn into their clothing. They knew they might not all return, but they also knew that doing nothing meant condemning the entire community to whatever horror the twins would unleash when they finally delivered. Chapter 5, The Confrontation. The 12 men arrived at the Miller farmhouse just after midnight on November 19th, the new moon hanging invisible in the sky, making the darkness absolute. They carried lanterns that seemed to push weakly against the oppressive blackness surrounding the property. The house stood silent, not a single light visible in any window, yet they all felt watched by dozens of eyes they couldn't see. The front door stood slightly ajar, an invitation or a trap, they couldn't know which. Daniel Lapp, the eldest among them at 63, pushed it open fully, and they entered in a tight group, each man's hand gripping the shoulder of the one in front of him, terrified of becoming separated in the darkness. Inside, the house was wrong in ways that defied immediate explanation. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slowly like the interior of some massive lung. The temperature fluctuated wildly from room to room, freezing cold in the kitchen, suffocatingly hot in the hallway, mild in the parlor where the trio sat waiting. Sarah and Rebecca occupied the same rocking chair somehow, their bodies positioned so they took up no more space than a single person, while Ezekiel stood behind them, his hands resting on both their shoulders. All three wore expressions of serene expectation, as if the confrontation was proceeding exactly as they'd foreseen. Daniel Lapp stepped forward and began to speak, his voice shaking but determined, reciting prayers and demanding the covenant be broken. But before he could finish, Sarah and Rebecca spoke in perfect unison, "You're too late, brothers. The quickening is complete. The vessel is prepared. In 3 days, he will walk in flesh as he once did in the old country, before your ancestors fled and thought they'd escaped." Their voices harmonized in a way that made every man present feel insects crawling beneath their skin. Ezekiel smiled, his teeth seeming too numerous, too sharp in the lamplight. What happened next would be recounted in whispered fragments for years. 3 of the 12 men, Jonas Byler, Aaron King, and Eli Bontrager, suddenly turned on their companions, their eyes reflecting the lamplight with a reddish glow that hadn't been there moments before. They attacked with inhuman strength, broken boards becoming clubs, farm tools grabbed from the walls becoming weapons. The remaining 9 fought back, but they were struggling against men who moved with unnatural speed and seemed to feel no pain. During the chaos, the twins remained motionless in their chair, their heads tilted at identical angles, watching the violence with expressions of mild interest, while their pregnant bellies moved with rhythmic pulses that matched no human heartbeat. The battle ended when Samuel Hirschberger, the blacksmith and strongest man in the settlement, managed to grab a lamp and hurl it at the wall, setting the curtains ablaze. The possessed men stopped immediately, turning toward the flames with expressions of shock as if waking from sleep. But the fire spread impossibly fast, racing across surfaces that shouldn't burn, climbing the walls with deliberate purpose. The 9 survivors dragged the 3 possessed men toward the door as smoke filled the room. Through the haze, they saw the twins rise from their chair with slow, synchronized grace, their hands cradling their swollen bellies, while Ezekiel stepped between them and the flames. His final words echoed through the burning house: "Fire won't stop what's been promised. Blood calls to blood. Bone calls to bone. 3 days, brothers. You'll bear witness whether you want to or not." The men fled into the night, carrying their wounded and their possessed, turning back only when they reached the road. The farmhouse was completely engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky like a sacrificial pyre. They expected to see the 3 figures burning inside, or escaping, or screaming. But they saw nothing, no shadows in the windows, no bodies fleeing, no sounds of distress. The house burned throughout the night and into the next day, the fire so hot it melted the snow in a perfect circle around the property. When it finally collapsed, the men approached cautiously, expecting to find 3 charred corpses in the ruins. They found nothing. No bodies, no bones, not even ash where 3 people should have died. Just the foundation in the cellar beneath, its doors standing untouched by flames, locked from the inside, with something behind it that scratched and whispered in languages older than English, older than German, older than any tongue spoken by men. Chapter 6: The Waiting. The 3 days following the fire felt like 3 years to the community. The possessed men, Jonas, Aaron, and Eli, remained in a strange state, neither fully conscious nor completely comatose. They'd been locked in Daniel Lapp's barn, restrained but comfortable, while the women took turns watching them. The men would stare at nothing for hours, then suddenly speak in that same unified voice the twins had used: 3 days. 2 days. 1 day. Counting down to something the watchers dreaded to imagine. The bishop visited them repeatedly, praying until his voice grew hoarse, but the possession seemed beyond his power to break. Meanwhile, investigators searched the ruins of the Miller farmhouse repeatedly. The cellar door remained locked, and no one had the courage to break it open. Strange sounds emanated from below, sometimes crying that sounded like infants, sometimes laughter that sounded like nothing human, sometimes a wet, organic sound like something massive breathing or growing in the darkness. A state fire marshal arrived to investigate the blaze but left within an hour, his face white, refusing to file a report or answer questions about what he'd heard from beneath the collapsed house. Sarah and Rebecca's family was questioned extensively, but Emma Yoder had fallen into complete catatonia, rocking in her chair and weeping without sound. Jacob Yoder, however, seemed grimly satisfied with the situation. When pressed by the elders, he finally revealed the full truth of the bargain he'd made. 30 years earlier, he'd been a young man farming poor land, watching his children starve through a brutal winter. In desperation, he'd sought out a man rumored to know the old ways, ways that predated Christianity's arrival in Europe, ways his own grandfather had whispered about before dying. This man, who called himself the Keeper, taught Jacob about the entity that lived in the spaces between, an ancient thing that had been worshipped and fed with blood before churches were built, before the modern world forgot that darker things existed in the corners of reality. The keeper told Jacob that the entity was generous to those who served it properly. It would grant prosperity, health, and protection, but it demanded a price that would come due when it called. Jacob agreed, not knowing the price would be his unborn daughters, not even conceived yet at the time of the bargain. The blood moon birth should have warned him, but by then he was bound by his word and by the prosperity the entity had granted. He'd raised Sarah and Rebekah specifically for this purpose, preparing them with rituals and recitations that opened their minds to the entity's influence. The ceremony in the barn when they turned 16? That's when they'd consciously accepted the role, when they'd ceased being his daughters and become the entity's brides, vessels waiting to birth something that would bridge the gap between its realm and ours. The community was horrified but helpless. The Ordnung had no protocols for demonic covenants. The bishop suggested bringing in English priests, perhaps Catholics who performed exorcisms, but Jacob laughed bitterly at the suggestion. You think their God has power here? You think your prayers matter when older forces are at work? The entity remembers when this land was virgin forest, when the first people here worshipped it with proper respect. It's been patient for centuries, but it won't wait any longer. In one more day, the twins will give birth, and what emerges will remake this place in the image of what it once was, before your churches, before your prayers, before you convinced yourselves you domesticated the wild dark places of the world. On the second night, Ruth Beeler had a dream, or a vision, she couldn't be certain. She saw the cellar beneath the burned house, and in it, the twins lay on a bed of earth, their bellies grotesquely swollen, far larger than they'd been before the fire. Ezekiel stood between them, but he was changing, his skin becoming translucent, something else visible beneath it like a second body trying to push through the first. The twins were awake and smiling, their hands clasped across the space between them, and they were singing a lullaby in that ancient language, singing to the things inside them that were almost ready to be born. Ruth woke screaming, and she wasn't alone. 17 other women in the community woke at the same moment, having witnessed the same dream, receiving the same message. Tomorrow at midnight, under the second new moon of the month, the births would occur, and everyone needed to decide whether they would flee or witness the arrival of something their world had forgotten could exist. Chapter 7, The Birthing. November 22, 1982, began with an unnatural silence. No birds sang, no animals stirred, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The community split into 3 groups, those who fled to relatives in distant settlements, those who locked themselves in their homes to pray, and those who felt compelled, by duty, by morbid fascination, or by the same force that had possessed Jonas, Aaron, and Eli, to bear witness at the ruins of the Miller farmhouse. By nightfall, 37 people stood in a loose circle around the burned foundation, carrying lanterns and candles that provided far less light than they should have against the pressing darkness. The possessed men had been brought, still restrained, still counting down in their unified voice, hours now. Minutes soon. Seconds before he walks. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the counting stopped, and all 3 men went rigid, their eyes rolling back, their mouths opening impossibly wide. The cellar door, which had remained locked and untouched by the fire, began to glow with a reddish light from the gaps around its frame. The scratching and whispering from below grew louder, resolving into a rhythmic sound like a heartbeat, but massive, as if the entire earth beneath them was the chest of some sleeping giant beginning to wake. At 11:58, the door burst open, and smoke, or something like smoke, if smoke could be thick and red and move with purpose, poured out of the cellar. Within it, shapes were visible, moving up the stairs. First came Ezekiel, but he was barely recognizable. His body had become a translucent shell through which something else was visible, a tall, skeletal figure with too many joints in its limbs, a head that was more skull than face, eyes that were deep pits filled with the same red light that glowed from the cellar. He moved with the predator's grace, each step perfectly placed, his attention fixed on the gathered crowd with an expression of hunger mixed with contempt. Behind him came the twins, walking side by side, moving in perfect synchronization as always. They were no longer pregnant, their bellies were flat beneath their charred dresses, but each carried something cradled in their arms, wrapped in cloth that might once have been white but was now stained with dark patterns that might have been blood or might have been symbols drawn in substances less natural. The babies, if they were babies, were silent, but the wrapped forms moved with a disturbing, independent motion, as if what they contained was already trying to escape its swaddling. Sarah and Rebecca's faces showed no pain, no exhaustion from labor, only that same serene satisfaction they'd worn since the wedding, the expression of duty fulfilled and purpose achieved. The entity wearing Ezekiel's skin spoke, and its voice was the grinding of stone on stone, the cracking of ice on a winter lake, the sound of things long dead trying to remember how to form words. Witnesses. Good. You'll carry the tale. You'll spread the story. You'll prepare others for the return. The covenant is complete. The blood price is paid. The doorway is opened. I am the first, but I will not be the last. In every generation, in every community that thought it fled the old ways, we will return. We are patient. We are eternal. We are what you forgot to fear. The wrapped bundles in the twins' arms began to writhe more violently, and sounds emerged from them, not crying, but clicking, chittering sounds like insects or like something trying to mimic human infant sounds and failing. Then the entity did something none of the witnesses expected. It reached out with hands that seemed to have too many fingers, and it touched the twins' faces gently, almost lovingly. My faithful vessels. You've served perfectly. Now rest. Sarah and Rebecca smiled, leaned into the touch, and their bodies simply collapsed. Not fell, not died in any normal sense, they collapsed like empty sacks, as if everything inside them, bones and organs and blood, had been instantly removed, leaving only skin that puddled on the ground like discarded clothing. The wrapped bundles they'd been carrying fell with them but landed without sound, and when the cloth fell away, what was revealed made 12 of the 37 witnesses flee screaming into the night, their minds broken by the impossibility of what they'd seen. The others stood frozen, unable to look away from the things that were even now beginning to split their cocoons and crawl toward the circle of observers with an eagerness that promised terrible hunger. Chapter 8, The Aftermath. The official report stated that a fire at the Miller farmhouse on November 15, 1982, resulted in 3 deaths, Ezekiel Miller and his wives Sarah and Rebecca Yoder Miller. The bodies were reportedly too badly burned for proper identification, and the remains were buried in a section of the Amish cemetery that is now overgrown and unmarked. The case was closed quickly, with no investigation into the inconsistencies in the timeline or the strange testimonies from community members. This is what the outside world knows. This is the sanitized version of events that allows people to sleep at night. The truth is known by the survivors, 37 people who stood at the ruins that night, 12 of whom fled and never spoke of what they saw, driven mad or driven silent by horror beyond their ability to process. The remaining 25 witnesses, including Daniel Lapp, Ruth Beeler, and the 3 formerly possessed men, made a pact of silence with the outside world but a pact of testimony with each other. They recorded what they'd seen in a journal written in Pennsylvania Dutch, hidden in a location known only to their descendants, to be opened only if the signs suggested the entity was preparing to return. What they recorded was this: the things that emerged from the bundles were neither human nor recognizably anything else. They were chimeric, assembled from parts that shouldn't fit together, growing and changing even as they watched. They had too many limbs that bent in wrong directions, faces that shifted between something almost human and something insectoid, skin that appeared to be covered in fine scales that reflected the lamplight like oil on water. Their mouths opened to reveal rows of teeth that seemed to grow and multiply as they watched, and their eyes, God help them, their eyes, were fully aware, intelligent, hungry, and utterly void of anything resembling human compassion or mercy. The entity wearing Ezekiel's skin gathered these offspring to itself with movements that were both protective and proprietary, like a farmer inspecting valuable livestock. Together they walked toward the circle of witnesses, and the crowd finally broke their paralysis, scrambling backward in terror. But the entity raised one translucent hand, and everyone froze again, locked in place by a force that felt like invisible chains wrapped around their chests and throats. It moved through the crowd slowly, examining each face with those pit-like eyes, and as it passed, people felt it rifling through their memories, their fears, their souls, leaving psychic fingerprints that would ache like bruises for months afterward. When it reached Jonas Byler, one of the 3 men who'd been possessed, it paused and placed a hand on his shoulder. Jonas convulsed, his body rigid, his eyes rolling back as something passed between them, information, corruption, a seed of influence that would never fully leave him. It did the same to Aaron King and Eli Bontrager, marking them as it had marked the twins years before, claiming them as future servants or witnesses or something worse. Then it spoke, and its voice bypassed their ears entirely, speaking directly into their minds with words that felt like nails being driven into brain tissue. Every generation, a family will be called. Every generation, a covenant will be made. You cannot stop it. You can only witness and remember, so that when the pattern repeats, some will recognize the signs and some will answer the call. This land remembers the old ways. This land will always remember. The entity and its offspring moved toward the forest then, toward the oldest trees where the settlement had never cleared, where even in daylight the shadows were thick and cold. The witnesses watched them disappear into the darkness between the ancient oaks and pines, watched until even the sounds of their movement faded into silence. Only then did the invisible force release them, dropping them to their knees gasping and sobbing with relief and horror in equal measure. The 3 marked men, Jonas, Aaron, and Eli, remained standing, their eyes now carrying that same reddish reflection when the light hit them at certain angles, their expressions distant and haunted as if they were listening to voices no one else could hear. The community held an emergency meeting the following morning, and the divisions were immediate and bitter. Some wanted to bring in outside help, police, federal authorities, anyone who might have the resources to hunt down and destroy what had escaped into the forest. But the elders, led by Daniel Lapp, argued that involving outsiders would only spread the contagion further. The entity wanted witnesses, wanted the story told, wanted fear to propagate like a disease. Bringing in skeptical authorities who would dismiss the testimonies as mass hysteria or religious delusion would only create more opportunities for the entity to move unseen, to infiltrate other communities, to find other families desperate enough to make bargains they didn't understand. Instead, they chose a different path, strategic silence with the outside world, but rigorous documentation and education within their own community and trusted neighboring settlements. Ruth Beeler began the journal that very day, writing down every detail while memories were fresh, forcing herself to describe what she'd seen even when her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. Other witnesses added their own accounts, each perspective capturing details the others had missed, building a comprehensive record of the covenant and its fulfillment. They wrote in Pennsylvania Dutch to keep it from casual English readers, but they wrote clearly and precisely, knowing that future generations would need to understand exactly what signs to watch for. The 3 marked men, Jonas, Aaron, and Eli, became the community's early warning system, though it cost them dearly. They reported dreams that were too vivid to be mere dreams, visions of the entity moving through the deep forest, of its offspring growing and learning, of other places where similar rituals were being prepared. Jonas began to draw maps in his sleep, waking to find he'd sketched locations he'd never visited, communities he'd never heard of, marking them with symbols that meant nothing to him consciously but that filled him with dread. Aaron developed the ability to sense when someone in the community was considering making a bargain, any bargain involving desperation and unknown powers, feeling it as a metallic taste in his mouth and a pressure behind his eyes. Eli could identify bloodlines that carried susceptibility to the entity's influence, sensing it in certain families like a scent only he could smell, a wrongness that clung to them like invisible smoke. The bishop, who had known more than he'd admitted from the beginning, died exactly 1 year after the confrontation. On his deathbed, he confessed the full scope of what he'd learned from Jacob Yoder and from his own research into the community's hidden history. The entity had been brought to America by European settlers who'd worshipped it in secret for generations, peasants who'd maintained the old ways even after Christianity became dominant, who'd passed down rituals and prayers and whispered teachings from parent to child. It had come to Kentucky with the first wave of Amish settlers, hiding in their shadows, patient and hungry, waiting for the isolation and insularity of their communities to provide the perfect breeding ground for covenants that could be made and fulfilled without outside interference. The bishop revealed that Jacob Yoder's family had been serving the entity for at least 4 generations, that his own grandfather had made a smaller bargain that brought prosperity but required a lesser price, a single child, stillborn, offered to the forest in the deep of winter. Each generation, the entity demanded more, building toward the ultimate goal, offspring that could walk in the physical world permanently, not just manifesting briefly but living, growing, spreading. The twins had been the culmination of a century of breeding and preparation, bloodlines carefully maintained, genetic susceptibilities cultivated, all leading to 2 girls who could serve as perfect vessels for something that existed partially outside normal reality. Jacob Yoder disappeared in March of 1983, walking into the forest on a morning that was unseasonably warm and misty. He'd told his wife Emma that he was being called to account, that the entity wanted to congratulate him on a bargain successfully completed. He was never seen again, though hunters occasionally reported finding his clothing in the deep woods, always arranged carefully on the ground as if he'd simply stepped out of it and walked on naked, leaving no footprints in the soft earth. Emma lived until 1995, catatonic and silent, tended by her remaining children who never married, never had children of their own, as if some instinctive knowledge told them their bloodline was too corrupted to continue safely. The Miller farmhouse ruins remained untouched for 2 years, avoided by everyone, until a mysterious buyer, later discovered to be a shell corporation with no traceable ownership, purchased the property. The cellar was filled with concrete mixed with salt, silver filings, and iron shavings, blessed by 7 different denominations of Christian ministers in a ceremony that was never recorded in any church documents. Then it was buried under 20 feet of earth, and a barn was built over the site. But no animals will enter that barn, not even to escape storms or predators. It stands empty today, slowly rotting, the wood warping in patterns that sometimes resemble faces or reaching hands, while the surrounding farms produce normal crops and normal families live normal lives, completely unaware of what sleeps in the earth beneath their neighbor's property. Epilogue: the pattern continues. This account was compiled from the original Pennsylvania Dutch Journal, from interviews with surviving witnesses conducted between 1982 and 2024, and from documents that were never meant to be public. The last of the original witnesses, Anna Beeler, daughter of the midwife Ruth Beeler, died in October 2024 at the age of 93. Before her death, she insisted this story be told in English, be shared beyond the insulated Amish communities, because the pattern is accelerating and the entity's influence is spreading. Anna reported that in her lifetime, she'd heard whispers of similar covenants in at least 17 other communities scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Not all involved twins, not all involved the Amish, but all shared common elements: isolated communities, families in desperate circumstances, promises made to powers that predated Christianity, and births that produced something not quite human. The three marked men, Jonas, Aaron, and Eli, maintained their vigil until their deaths in 2003, 2008, and 2015 respectively, and each one passed on their curse to a chosen successor, young men who accepted the burden of awareness in exchange for the ability to sense the entity's movements and warn others. The current Watchers report increasing activity. More blood moon births. More families facing impossible hardships who pray to God but receive answers from something older. More men like Ezekiel appearing in struggling communities, offering solutions that seem heaven-sent but carry prices that aren't revealed until it's too late. The entity that emerged in 1982 was the first in this generation, but intelligence suggests it won't be the last. The offspring that walked into the forest have never been found, but animals in that region have changed. There are wolves now where there were no wolves before, and they move in patterns that suggest intelligence beyond instinct, and their eyes reflect red in the lamplight. For those reading this who live in or near isolated religious communities, watch for these signs: twins born during lunar eclipses or blood moons, especially girls, especially in families with a history of unusual prosperity followed by tragedy. Men who arrive from elsewhere with unclear origins who court young women in unusual ways, who speak of old traditions and blood bonds. Families who suddenly prosper after years of hardship, whose crops grow too well, whose animals are too healthy, whose children are too quiet and too obedient. Ceremonies that happen in barns or cellars instead of churches. Books written in languages that seem familiar but aren't quite German, aren't quite any known dialect. And most of all, covenants spoken of in whispers, bargains that involve blood, promises made to things that aren't named directly. If you see these signs, the Watchers can be contacted. There are still people who carry the burden of knowledge, who maintain the records, who know how to recognize the entity's influence and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, how to interrupt a covenant before it's completed. They cannot be named publicly for their own protection, but within Amish and Mennonite communities, certain families are known as the Wachter, the Watchers, and they can be found by those who truly need them. The covenant made in 1982 changed everything. Before then, the entity had been content with small bargains, brief manifestations, limited influence. But the twin birth, the perfect vessels, the successful creation of physical offspring, that was a threshold crossed. It proved that the entity could permanently bridge the gap between its realm and ours, that it could produce children who would grow and spread and make their own covenants. The pattern is no longer a cycle of individual bargains but a spreading infection, a genealogical curse that propagates through bloodlines and communities. Anna Baller's final testimony, recorded 2 weeks before her death, contained this warning: they're preparing for something bigger. The whispers speak of a gathering, a year when multiple covenants will be completed simultaneously, when enough offspring will emerge to establish a permanent presence. The entity has learned patience over centuries, but its patience is ending. It wants to stop hiding in the shadows in the forests. It wants to walk in daylight, to be acknowledged, to be worshipped openly as it was in the old days before the churches came. And it's breeding an army of children to make that happen. She also shared something she'd never told anyone. In her dreams for the past 5 years, she'd seen Sarah and Rebecca Yoder. Not as they were when they died, collapsed skin and emptied flesh, but as they might have been in another life, young and innocent and free. They visited her in these dreams to apologize, explaining that they'd been groomed since birth, that they'd never had a chance to be anything other than what they became, that the entity had been living in their minds since they were infants. But they also warned her that other girls were being prepared the same way, that the grooming process had become more sophisticated, harder to detect, and that some of the marked children didn't even know they were marked until the entity called and they answered with voices they didn't recognize as their own. The Miller farmhouse is gone, but the land remembers. The cellar may be sealed, but the connection was made, and connections like that don't fully close. The entity walked into the forest with its offspring in 1982, but it didn't leave Kentucky, didn't abandon the community that fed it so well. It's still there, in the oldest trees, in the deepest shadows, in the spaces between human settlements where the wild places remember what they were before civilization tried to tame them. And it's still patient, still breeding, still calling to desperate people who mistake its voice for the answer to their prayers. This is not a story with a happy ending. This is a warning written in blood and documented in the testimonies of people who saw what shouldn't be seen and survived to tell about it. The twin sisters who married the same man were not victims and they were not villains, they were weapons, carefully forged over 2 decades, aimed at the barrier between our reality and something older, something that wants back in. And the trigger was pulled successfully in 1982. The covenant is complete. The blood price was paid. The doorway stands open. And on the other side, something is still breeding, still growing, still preparing for the day when it no longer needs covenants and bargains and desperate families to bring it into our world. Because that day is coming. The Watchers know this. The descendants know this. And now, so do you. If you found this story disturbing, good. It should disturb you. Because somewhere tonight, in some isolated community, twins are being born under an eclipsed moon. And somewhere, a man with patient eyes and scarred hands is preparing to offer solutions to a desperate family. And somewhere, the entity that wore Ezekiel Miller's skin like a suit is teaching its offspring how to smile like humans, how to speak like humans, how to walk among us undetected until the moment comes to drop the disguise and show what they really are. The pattern continues. The covenant was not unique. And the horror that began in 1982 in rural Kentucky is spreading, slowly but inevitably, like blood seeping into clean water. Watch for the signs. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong even if it looks right. And remember, not every answer to prayer comes from God. Some prayers are answered by things that were listening long before God's name was ever spoken. This account is dedicated to Anna Beeler, 1931 to 2024, Ruth Beeler, 1921 to 1995, and all the witnesses who carried the burden of knowledge so that others might recognize the darkness when it comes calling. May their warning not be in vain. The end.